2, Modulations. Welcome to week 2 of the course. We're going to break this week down into a few constituent topics, some of which I'm going to do via video and some of which I'm going to do in the live class. In video, we're going to review modulation based on what you learned last year, and I'm going to introduce some new content. We're also going to do a lesson on tonicization specifically, which you did encounter briefly last year, but I'm going to expand this in significantly more detail and talk about larger situations where this can occur. In the live class, we're going to focus a lot more on composition. So please bring staff paper to class. And what we'll essentially do is we'll do practice progressions in that class. It'll be very similar to what you did last year in your tutorial sessions. Let's get started. So first, what is a modulation? Well, you probably learned last year that a modulation is essentially a shift or a change to a new key. In terms of how it's notated, we tend to use accidentals to indicate modulation if it's happening inside of a section, but we tend to use a change of key signature if it's happening at the start of a new section. So basically, if you've got a double bar line happening and you've got to change to new content, then that's where we would change the key signature as opposed to just use accidentals. Modulations are actually a little bit easier to define than you might think, and that's because they tend to involve consistent or recurring changes of accidentals. So in other words, if you're seeing a B natural, for example, repeatedly throughout the music, it means you probably changed to a key that incorporates that B natural. But modulation is not just about changing the accidentals. So for example, if I'm changing between a key and its relative minor, there is no change of accidental. I don't necessarily know that there's a change of key signature. So what we can also look for is a change of tonic. In most keys, scale degrees 1 and 5 and the tonic and dominant chords are the most commonly used notes or chords in those keys. So if you start to see a shift to using, for example, 3 and 7, notes, the repetition of notes that are not 1 and 5, then that's actually suggesting that you're going to have a modulation of some kind. Let's take a look at a sample progression. Let's have a listen before we begin. There's a few features here that actually tell us that this is in a particular key. When we learned this concept in our CM or in 191, probably the first thing you did was to take a look at the key signature. So in this case, we have a 2-flat key signature, and that tells us it's either going to be B flat major or G minor. I'm going to take a brief second here just to say that it tends to be in this course that people forget that minor exists as a concept. Don't forget that the minor key is always an option based on the key signature. But there's more than just the key signature that we can look at. So for example, the extra F sharp accidental that we're seeing on beat 2 suggests that this is in the minor key rather than the major key. But what's a little bit confusing in this example is that we see F naturals later on, towards the end of the second bar. So we actually need more evidence to confirm whether we're in G minor or not. A place that's useful to look to make this decision is particularly the first chord of the piece. The first chord of a piece is typically 1 or 5 in pieces that are in classical style. So the fact that we have a G minor chord on our beat 1 here confirms we're in the key of G minor. If this was a B flat major piece, we would probably have a B flat major chord or an F major chord here. So we notice something changes in bar 2 in this example. Starting here, the note and chord emphasis changes. We no longer have 1 or 5 chords in G minor. In other words, we're not seeing G chords or D chords. And we don't really have G's or D's in the melody either. You can see we've got E flat, B flat, F, and then moving down to D. But there seems to instead be repeated Fs, particularly we can see that in the bass and in our melody. And we can see that B flat occurs in 2 voices in our last bar. So that's suggesting we have a shift to an emphasis on B flat and F. These are scale degrees 1 and 5 in the key of B flat major, which is our relative major key. The final chord being a B flat chord also confirms that a new tonic occurs. So these are all hints that we probably have a modulation happening here. We don't have F sharps anymore. We've got a shift of emphasis of notes, and the last chord is B flat major. I want to introduce some new terminology here, which I think is going to be helpful in our discussion. Throughout this course, I'm going to use the terms diatonic and chromatic. When I use the term diatonic, what I'm saying is that it essentially just uses the accidentals or the notes from the key signature itself. So in other words, we don't have added accidentals in this case. When I use the term chromatic, what I mean is that the passage or the piece uses accidentals that are from outside of that key signature. So in the example that we see below, the first section I have boxed as your diatonic music because there are no extra accidentals. The blue box I have towards the ending is a chromatic passage because we have the addition of that D sharp. So this passage is mostly diatonic with a short chromatic section. We're going to talk about a couple different kinds of modulation throughout the year, but in Music 292, we're actually going to focus on two particular kinds of modulation. Pivot modulation, which you learned last year, is the most common diatonic modulation. It uses a shared chord as a transition or overlap point, and we're going to walk that through in just a few minutes. We'll also talk about direct modulation this year, which is the second most common modulation that we see in this repertoire. In direct modulation, your piece goes directly into the new key with no overlap or moment of transition. The other three kinds of modulation I'll talk through now, but just so you know, we're going to focus on these more specifically in Music 293. Common tone modulation uses a note rather than a chord held in common as a transition or overlap point. So it's similar to pivot, but it's using fewer notes. Chromatic modulation is an extension essentially of the pivot concept, but it uses chromatic chords instead of diatonic chords. And enharmonic, probably the most complicated of the 5 modulation types, uses a pivot chord to modulate, but this pivot chord is enharmonically respelled in a new key. Don't worry if you don't understand what that means right now. We're not going to have to worry about that until January. In this course, pivot modulation and direct modulation are the two types that you'll need to worry about. So let's walk through our process of pivot modulation. Let's start by listening to our progression again to get it familiar. I've gone and I've added in the Roman numerals for us here so that we can get a sense of what's happening in the piece. You'll notice that there's a region of chords where I could analyze them in G minor or I could analyze them in B flat major. They work in both possible keys. Normally with a pivot modulation, I want to reduce that down to just one chord, and we'll talk in a few minutes about which chord is the choice that we would make here. But you'll notice that that chord that is the overlapping chord, it has the same quality in both keys. 6 is a major chord in G minor, 4 is a major chord in B flat major. That will be the case when we're dealing with pivot modulations. What I'm indicating here with the notation is that at this moment, 6 is reheard as 4 in the new key. So it kind of has a dual existence. We're hearing it with both functions. Next, let me add in the harmonic functions to talk a little bit about how these chords are acting within the phrase itself. You can see that I've indicated a few prolongations here in the G minor section. So we establish our tonic, we create stability that helps us to hear the key to start. We then move into a region of subdominant. It's actually very common to pivot in subdominant regions because subdominants act as transitions, or essentially as connection. And pivots also act as connection. You're not limited to having these in subdominant areas, but they're common in subdominant areas. So we can see that we do have a bigger scale TSDT progression, but essentially our S flips from being in G minor to being in B flat major. And then we conclude with our D to T happening in the new key. Notice the way that I'm notating modulation here. I'm using the zigzag bracket to essentially separate off my two keys from one another. Do be careful where you're placing this bracket. I've noticed students in past years have actually put the bracket the opposite way around, but you're actually saying something different if you do that. You need to make sure it essentially is acting as a wall between your G minor stuff and your B flat major stuff. Let's take a look at another example. This one's in an A major. Let's have a listen. So in this particular case, we actually go through a complete TSDT first before we get to moving on to our modulation content. One of the things I want to talk about in this example is where exactly we place the pivot chord. The pivot chord location usually occurs on the chord before the new accidental is introduced. So we can see that the D sharp, the added accidental, happens in our 5 chord in this case, which means it's the chord before that where we're going to want to put the pivot. Now you're probably looking at this and saying, you haven't actually put this on the chord before. But just to clarify, a cadential 6/4 is considered to be one chord, even though it has 2 components to it, because it only has one Roman numeral 5. So the 6 becoming 2 is the chord that occurs before that 5 chord. So just to summarize, your pivot chord is typically going to be the chord before your new accidental occurs, or slightly before that. In classical style music, pivot modulations normally move to a closely related key. And this occurs because closely related keys are the keys that have notes in common. In other words, they're the ones that you can create the shared chord with. You probably haven't encountered this term before, though. Closely related key is a key that differs by no more than one sharp or flat from the home key. So for example, if we're starting in C major, which you can see I've highlighted in purple here, if we add one accidental, we can add one sharp to get G major, or we could add one flat to get F major. Those are one accidental difference from our C major key. But we also have the relative minors as well that share those key signatures. So A minor is the same key signature as C major, so it's not that different. E minor has one sharp, so it's only one accidental difference. And D minor has one flat, so it's only one accidental difference. Closely related keys are the most common modulations in classical form. You'll also may have noticed as I was talking through this chart that these are some of the typical relationships you're used to hearing in keys. So if we're looking at in the horizontal direction, these chords actually build dominant relationships with one another. G is the dominant of C, C is the dominant of F. And as I already pointed out, if we're looking in the vertical direction, these are relative majors and minors of one another. So that's another way you can figure it out. There are two particular modulations that are the most common in classical style, and we can kind of consider them the defaults for the sake of analysis. If you're starting in a major key, the most common key that you're going to modulate to is the dominant key. And if you're starting in a minor key, the most common key that you're going to modulate to is the relative major, or if you want to think of it in terms of Roman numeral, the key of 3. These are closely related keys, and it helps to have a really smooth connection between your home key and the next tonal area that it's going to. So now that we've talked about some of the theory behind it, let's take a look at a practical example. I'm going to start you with a small passage here, and then you're going to continue with this on perusal as part of your group analysis. Let's have a listen to the piece, which starts in F major. Focus particularly on the music that's happening in the third system. You'll notice there that you have some C sharps that get introduced. So let's zoom in on that a little bit closer. I've added in some Roman numerals for you here, and you'll notice that the first bar and a half or so is in D minor. So we've got the one flat key signature, and then the C sharps that consistently happen to bring us into the minor key. You'll notice that immediately after that, with no pivot whatsoever, I've actually written F major and then Roman numerals in that key. And this is what a direct modulation is. There's no transition point. We just immediately go into the new key. It's the most common that you'll see these at phrase boundaries. In other words, you'll see it happening after the end of one phrase and just before the beginning of the next phrase. Because essentially direct modulations are very abrupt, so we want them to correspond to moments of change. This, by the way, is how we're going to indicate phrasing in this course. We're going to use slurs to show the starting and endings of phrases. Make sure when you draw those that the start of your slur is just before the first note you want to include, and the end of your slur is just after the last note that you want to include in your phrase. So this is direct modulation. We're immediately going to a new key. It's a very simple concept. You don't need to worry about pivots. You don't need to worry about overlaps. So that's it for the instructional content on modulation. Next, I'm going to ask you to go to the Pearsall group analysis to work through some other examples from the same piece. And you'll be able to make some decisions about whether you think that these are pivot modulations or whether you think that these are direct modulations. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.